Do you want to learn how to craft irresistibly complex characters that will feel like real people to your reader? Do you want your readers to not be able to put that book down until they know exactly what happens to each and every one of your characters? This video is everything you'll need to craft deep, layered characters that your readers will just eat up.
Welcome to The Plottery, where I teach writers just like you how to make storytelling become second nature.
Hello everyone, I'm Shar. I'm a fiction writing coach, and today I will be talking about how to create complex characters for your novel. Now, let's first have a quick talk about why it's important to actually have complex characters in your novel. Now, unless you're writing fairy tales, you don't want your novel to have purely good or evil characters. You want to find a middle ground. You want to find morally gray characters. You want to craft complex characters with layers to them. Layers that your readers will just love to untangle. This is probably the core of every book that I've ever loved. This is the common denominator of every media piece that actually makes it big. They have incredible, layered, irresistible characters. So today I'm going to teach you how you can do the same thing for your book. Here are 3 character mistakes that you should be aiming to avoid within your novel. First of all, you don't want your characters to fall flat. Second of all, you don't want them to feel stereotypical. And third of all, you don't want them to feel like they are just there for the sake of the plot. Instead, what you want to aim for is creating this feeling of knowing real people, of letting your readers actually get to know who your character is, get to know what makes them tick, get to know everything there is to know about them, and want to know more. You want to aim to create a very intimate story, a very intimate connection between your characters and your reader throughout your novel, because that is how you hook your readers. That is how you make your readers become fans rather than readers. It's how you make the story come to life. It's how you make your characters come to life. So we'll start with the thing that everyone loves most and knows so much about. Am I right, guys? Internal conflict. That's right. So internal conflict, if you haven't heard of it before, where have you been living? It's all the rage. It's all the rage in the writing community, guys. Internal conflict is where it's at. If you don't have internal conflict, you do not have a character. If you don't have internal conflict, there is no story. There is no reason for us to follow along. There is absolutely no reason for us to connect with the story as readers. So internal conflict is extremely crucial, an extremely crucial aspect of every single story that there is. Internal conflict is essentially the entire reason that your character exists. Now, I know I drone on about internal conflict, and you've probably seen several other writing coaches or YouTubers or whatever you want to call them, but you've probably heard most of them talk about internal conflict and why it's so important to your story. So before we kind of dive into this, let's just break down what exactly internal conflict is. So internal conflict is actually not that difficult to find. You do it by simply giving your character a struggle or a flaw or some kind of trauma or some kind of issue that they carry from the past, and your story is the place where they're going to overcome it. So essentially, internal conflict is the reason you're telling this story. Internal conflict is the character journey that you are taking that person on. It's the whole reason that the story even exists in the first place, because this person, your protagonist, your hero, your main character, they have something that they need to overcome, and they have some kind of struggle, they have some kind of flaw, they have something that they've been carrying with them from the past, from before we even met them. And this story is the moment that they overcome it. Now, you can find your character conflict quite easily just by giving them that struggle and then having to think about how your character journey is going to develop from that struggle. So how is your character actually going to overcome this thing that you've burdened them with at the beginning of the story? And you want to do this by asking yourself 3 very simple questions. What is the struggle? Where does that struggle come from? So exploring their backstory a little bit. And 3, how are you planning on having them overcome this struggle by the end of your story, or not overcome it? Definitely do not skip that part, because that is absolutely the foundation of your character. It is the most crucial thing about a character. To have that internal conflict, you have to have it. This is not a skippable thing. This is not an option. You cannot skip internal conflict. You need to have internal conflict, because if you don't have internal conflict, you don't have a story, and that character has absolutely no purpose for existing in your story. Okay, the next thing we're going to talk about is backstory. Now, what you as the author need to know is who your character was before we actually met them as readers. Your character needs to have existed before the story actually happens, and you need to be aware of that as someone who's writing that character. You need to know a couple of the things that they went through before we actually got to meet them. And one of the things that this plays into is obviously your internal conflict, because remember the question that we asked, where does their struggle come from? That's something you need to know, and you need to know it very, very, very well. Now, you don't have to go into detail about absolutely everything in your backstory. I see a lot of newbie writers kind of coming into this backstory advice very heavily and mapping out literally everything that has ever happened to their character from the moment that they were born to the moment that we meet them in the story, and sometimes even beyond that, of like what happens in their life afterwards. You don't need to know all of this. You don't need to know all of the details. You don't need to know who their childhood crush was or what their first pet was if it's not actually relevant to their internal conflict or to other parts of the story. The thing that gets me when I see people actually going into so much detail about the backstory is that they actually miss the important stuff that they should have thought about. They get everything else. They get absolutely the entire history of that character, but they completely miss the only stuff that actually mattered that they should have figured out in the backstory for their characters. What you do want to know from a character's backstory is what happened to them that made them the way that they are right now. Because a lot of things will have happened to your character, but not all of them are a direct reason as to why we are in this position in the beginning of the book with that character. Not all of them are gonna have any kind of influence on your character, but we need to know the ones that do have an influence. Things that influence the way that your character acts right now, the things that matter to your character, or the thing that's driving their internal conflict. Now, if you don't figure out these things in your character's backstory, you run the risk of your character existing solely for the purpose of your story or your plot. And this directly translates into your plot, leading your characters, which is something that you definitely want to avoid if you're trying to create complex characters with their own sense of agency in the story. So, that being said, let's move on into your character has to be leading your plot. A good complex character will never fall victim to an author's plot. It is your job as the author to recognize when your character does not want to do what you set them out to do. Now, I'm going to give you an example of this actually happening to me very recently in the main project that I'm working on at the moment. It's called Statue of a Woman. Maybe a few of you might know I do have a writing Instagram called Writing by Shar, which you can check out if you want to go and stalk me there, and you can learn all about my lovely projects and my characters and geek out with me over them if you want to. But for the sake of this video, plot leading characters, this happened to me once because I have my main character Liv. She's a 12-year-old girl, and we have Jamie. He is a groundskeeper. He's a grown-up. Doesn't matter really for the prospect of why I'm telling this. But what happened was I had mapped out in the plot that Jamie was going to be a sort of consolation character to Liv. So he was going to be a supporting character to her. He was going to be the one person that truly understands her and understands where she's coming from, and they were going to connect, and they were going to kind of just be there, each other's shoulders to lean on. But then I got into writing this one chapter, particularly chapter 6, I think, so this is about a third of the way into my book, maybe a little bit more. Liv just was not cooperating with me. I was writing from her perspective in that chapter, and she did not like Jamie at all. She didn't like him in the slightest. She absolutely despised Jamie's guts. I was trying to write her as being open-minded towards him and kind of connected to him in the sense that I had planned within my plot, but she was not having it. She was not having it at all. So what I did instead is I kind of took a step back and I listened to her, and I started writing it in a way that I felt like she wanted me to. So I let her experience that sense of conflict from him. I let her kind of explain that unease that she was getting from him to me as the author. I let her get on with it, and I wrote her in a way where she did not like him and where I understood where it was coming from by the end of the chapter, and that actually revealed the entire purpose of my project to me. And that was mind-blowing. That was a mind-blowing moment in the sense of this project, because I had never even considered that to be a thing. I had never even considered that she would be jealous of him in any way. I did put him there as a supporting character, but now allowing her to kind of take me on that journey and express her feelings for what was logical for her to feel in the moment. It made me discover so much about the characters and so much about what might have gone wrong in my plotting, because as one person, you can't necessarily predict exactly everything that's going to happen in your plot. And that's why plotting should only be done to a certain extent, and you need to let your characters lead the rest of that plot forward because they know what they're doing. And once you get into the headspace of one character, you are going to be able to see their story a lot better than looking at it from a broad overview of an actual plot line. Okay, one more thing to be aware of is balance. Balance in your characters' virtues and flaws. You want to make sure that you are not creating characters who are just flaws or just virtues. So first of all, you want to avoid overly flawed characters. I know everyone gives you the advice to put flaws into your characters, to make sure that your characters are flawed, to make sure that there is something wrong with them, that they are not perfect, blah, 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 blah. Yes, of course you don't want to have a perfect character, but they don't tell you to balance it out, which is something you absolutely 100% need to do. You need to make sure that there is some kind of balance between what's good in that character and what's bad in that character. Because if you only show your readers the bad stuff, the flaws, the struggles, it can get so overwhelming. We're gonna end up not actually liking that character that we are reading about, and we're gonna end up not having any sympathy for them, which is the furthest position that you want to be in when you are crafting a character. You want your readers to be right there with them. You want your readers to be sympathetic to their cause, to their goal, to who they are as a person. You don't want to push your readers away from that character by making them completely inaccessible and overly flawed and just too much. Similarly, this can also result in very depressing and heavy stories. If that's not the thing that you're going for, again, kind of easing off from the flaws and the struggles of your character can be a good thing. On the other tip of the scale, you want to avoid characters who feel too perfect. So you don't want to have someone that is capable at everything, that can do everything. And you also don't want to just say that they have flaws and never show us those flaws, or say that they have insecurities but never have them act on those insecurities. One more thing you want to be aware of is avoiding self-inserts, or sort of blank page characters is what I like to call them. These characters are basically what happens when the author just kind of writes from the perspective of a person or a reader, and they don't necessarily give too much thought about who the character that they're writing about is, and they just end up making them a general sort of insert character that your reader can kind of position themselves into. I think that's the reason that people go into making these types of characters, is that they want the reader to be able to relate to them. However, this kind of produces a counter effect, which means that your character is probably not going to feel real at all, and it's definitely not going to be relatable. So how do you strike this perfect balance? How do you find a way for your characters to feel actually real and not too overwhelming and not too perfect? My answer to this is I usually like to give them one big flaw, maybe a couple of tiny little minor flaws to just kind of round them out a little bit, but these minor flaws should not be overpowering. They should not be like an issue in your story. They should not cause too much conflict, and they should not be at the forefront. You should only have one flaw at the forefront, and that's the one that we are hoping to resolve by the end of the story, right? With your internal conflict. And once you have that one flaw and you have a couple of little flaws, you need to space that out with virtues. You need to balance it out, because virtues are the reason that we're actually going to root for your character. So it is very important to actually include those, and not only mention them, not only say that like this character does charity work. Show them doing the charity work. Show us what you actually mean by their virtues. Don't tell us that they're a great friend. You need to show us that in action for us to feel that and for us to root for them. Okay, now let's summarize everything that we've learned and everything that you should take away from this video. So, internal conflict is your number one thing. The more you know about what they're struggling with, why they're struggling with it, how they are going to overcome it, and how you can make it even more difficult for them to overcome it, the juicier your character is going to feel. Now, you want to also remember that a character is not just one thing. They're not just one struggle. They're not just one flaw. They are going to be an accumulation of so many things, because we're complex. We're humans. We have emotions. We have struggles, insecurities, so much that we have to deal with. And your character doesn't have to overcome all of that in your book. You need to focus, you need to pick one thing that they're going to overcome throughout your story, but still be aware that there might be more difficulties in their life, that there might be more struggles with whatever it is that they're experiencing. Basically, you want to be aware that your character exists outside of your plot. They are not just a one-dimensional strand of something that happens in your plot. They're not just a representation of your plot. They need to be their own thing. They need to be their own hero. They need to have their own story. Again, the things that they are actually struggling with, they might not actually be aware of most of these things. They might just have adapted this as a way of life. And it is your job as the author to allow them to unpack this by throwing external situations at them and letting them deal with them based on what it is that they need to learn. This is why your story is never going to be about the external issues. It's always about the internal conflict. That is what the core of a story is. Story is actually about how all of these external issues that you're creating are going to affect the internal struggles of your character. Now, I highly recommend watching my Pantser's Guide to Plotting if you want to know how you can create a story really easily once you have your cast of complex and lovely fleshed out characters. Thank you so much for tuning in. Right on, and I will see you on the flip side.